Our next speakers, we have a wonderful panel. All right, we've got to do some setup. In the meantime, I'm going to do my best to introduce the gentleman that will be on this panel. Unfortunately, I don't have full biographies for all of them. So once we're set up here and the gentlemen come forward, I'd like each of them to give us a brief introduction of their background before they start. We're going to have with us today, and now I'm going to have to find the right page for our track here. Brendan Keefe is a reporter with NBC's Channel 2 in Houston. Brendan, are you here today? Hi, Brendan. And he's going to serve as the moderator. We have Houston City Councilman Rob Todd. Is Rob here today? Hi, Rob. Okay, Rob's here. That's great. He represents the Clear Lake and Kingwood areas of Houston, which are home to many aerospace companies and educational institutions. Next, we have Walter Cunningham. Is Walter here today? All right, Walter is here. Walter has enjoyed careers in the military, civilian government service, and private industry. He began his career as a Marine Corps fighter pilot and holds the rank of Colonel, U.S. Marine Corps retired. He has 4,500 hours of pilot time. He graduated from UCLA with a degree in physics, and he also went to the Harvard Graduate School of Business. He is best known as NASA's second civilian astronaut, and in 1968 he orbited the Earth 163 times as the pilot of Apollo 7, the first man flight of the Apollo program. He spent 2.5 years as chief of the Skylab branch of the astronaut office before entering private business in Houston in 1971. Mr. Cunningham is a successful businessman, entrepreneur, venture capitalist, lecturer, author. He wrote The All-American Boys, host of Lift Off to Logic, a radio talk show, and he's currently chairman of the Texas Aerospace Commission. He is the recipient of numerous national and international honors, including a member of the Astronaut Hall of Fame. I'd like to thank Mr. Cunningham for providing a full biography for the program booklet. And I'd like to welcome these gentlemen here today, and also I'd like to thank Marianne Dyson for setting up such a wonderful panel. Marianne, did you have some words?
And apologies, we had a PowerPoint projector supposed to be in here with these charts with all the pretty pictures, the beautiful graphics behind us. But we're prepared as mission controllers. We have to have a backup system, so we got transparencies. So we're going to ask Mr. Cunningham if he would first just give us a quick summary of what the Texas Aerospace Commission role is, and a little bit about how they operate and what sort of things they do here in Texas. And before we go into the regular discussion, and I'll give you that microphone over there, and then Mr. Keefe.
Thanks, Marianne. The Texas Aerospace Commission dates back about 10 years, although when it was initially organized back in the 1980s, it was an unfunded commission, and they appointed various people around the state, political appointees, who were distributing it geographically and hopefully having a little bit of aerospace background, if possible. It was sunsetted. The Sunset Law put it out of business several years later. Several active enthusiasts for space got the Space Commission reinstated again about 4 years ago now, this time with a budget, huge budget of $200,000 a year. And yours truly was appointed, and the current chairman of the Texas Aerospace Commission. What's the Texas Aerospace Commission do? Its principal charge, in fact, you might say its only charge really is in the area of economic development. Economic development for the state in the specialized area of aerospace business. We have a lot of aerospace industry here in the state. The crown jewel of that aerospace industry, of course, is the Johnson Space Center down here in Clear Lake. I don't have off the top of my head the numbers of billions of dollars that it means to the state of Texas, but approximately $3.5 billion flows through the Johnson Space Center by itself. And we have tremendous centers of interest in Dallas, a lot of electronics, aviation. It's the headquarters of several airlines. Of course, we've got Cunningham Airlines here in Houston. You've got a center of excellence in the San Antonio area that's being built up around maintenance. The old Kelly facility that's now being run by Boeing down there to provide maintenance for commercial aircraft. There is, in Austin, you have areas of entrepreneurship, but probably the single biggest principal area is right here in the Clear Lake area. The Clear Lake Economic Development Foundation has done a tremendous job towards enhancing economic development in aerospace in this area. But what is the job of Texas Aerospace Commission? On $200,000 you can't do very much. Right now that covers a executive director. We're very fortunate to have Mr. Tom Mosier as executive director. He spent over 20 years with NASA, was there at the beginning, and at one point was head of the development of the space shuttle a long time ago. Spent 10 years in the commercial aerospace industry after that, and now in a semi-retired, I convinced him to come back, and he's heading up our efforts at the Texas Aerospace Commission as executive director. We have an assistant director, and we have a secretary. And that's principally what $200,000 goes for, a little bit of a travel budget. So what we do is we attempt to be a resource, a quarterback, anything we can do to help local agencies that want to, that have to step forward to encourage this business. For example, there's a German light aircraft manufacturer or a military training aircraft manufacturer that we've been talking to for about a year that looks like they'll be very serious about moving down into the valley, down in the Corpus Christi area. We've had a hand in the Boeing coming in and taking over the Kelly facility. The FAA is looking to establish an engineering center someplace in the country. And through our contacts, we heard about it because we had not been solicited, if you will, and now one of the principal candidates for that is DFW. For the last 9 months to a year, probably our principal effort has been looking at the prospects for a Texas spaceport. Those of you that follow this industry closely realize that there are a few official spaceports around the country. We've got Florida, you've got California where they have a spaceport, Virginia, Wallis Island is out there, and there are probably another 18 or 20 states that would like to have spaceports. Some of them make a lot of sense, some of them don't. I can tell you that Texas is an eminently good prospect for a spaceport. What's that consist of? That means you have to have the facilities to handle launch and most likely recovery as well of some kind of launch vehicle. Nobody's going to displace what Kennedy Space Center does. It's a government facility. There's probably a half a dozen companies today that are looking to develop reusable launch vehicles. Tom and I have visited all of those half a dozen. Many of them are started up, operated by people we've known for a long time. All half a dozen of those companies are not going to make it. Some of them that you probably think are going to make it, I might take great exception to. So it's a matter of opinion if you want to put your money down and take some chances. However, some of them look like better prospects than others. Regardless, these commercial companies are looking to have someplace better, more convenient to launch from than a government-controlled facility. There's a lot of talk about privatizing Kennedy Space Center, for example. And it will take something like that before it becomes truly attractive to a commercial operating company. Right now, the impetus that you see going on about spaceports around the country is all motivated, triggered, if you will, by Venture Start. The Lockheed proposed vehicle single stage to orbit. It's kind of the 800-pound gorilla that's sitting out there when it comes to reusable launch vehicles. I'm one of those that's not optimistic that it's ever going to actually fly. They've got about $1.3 billion into it, and I think Lockheed just committed another couple $100 million into it to develop the X-33 to do a demonstration and what have you. But it's a far cry from actually flying. But you cannot ignore a project that's got $1.3 billion into it. They went out and solicited qualifications for proposals, not even a request for proposal. And you'd be amazed how many places around the country have responded. I think they had 32 different locations that responded as wanting to be a potential spaceport for VentureStar. Well, some of them make more sense than others, and as I said, Texas makes a lot of sense. We threw our hat in the ring, if you will, and started soliciting interest around the state. We had 13 different locations here in Texas that felt like they ought to at least be considered for a spaceport. I need to emphasize again and again that the Texas Aerospace Commission is not pursuing a spaceport. We are encouraging a spaceport. We are enthusiastic about it. We are providing all the support we can, but we cannot get a spaceport. We can deal with the legislature, we can help get legislation through, and we can provide know-how to the locations that do that. And they were very enthusiastic about that. These 13 locations have kind of self-selected themselves down to about 3 now that are making serious inroads and have serious conversations going on. One of those sites is in Pecos County in West Texas, and it's one of the probably more likely candidates out there to develop a reusable launch vehicle. I don't know if they've mentioned what it is, but Kistler is looking at it. As you know, Kistler has been talking to the state of Nevada about launching there. They've got a lot of barren federal ranges, if you will. And the way I like to put it, we've got just as good a open, barren plains here in Texas as they do in Nevada. Nevada hasn't done all that well up to now, I guess, and so you had Kistler was looking at Australia to do their first launches at least. Anyhow, we now have conversations going on between Kistler and the people in Pecos County, and we're being as supportive as we can, providing whatever support we can for it. In addition, a couple of other sites that you've heard about in the news, Brazoria County and Kennedy County, are good locations for recoverable launch vehicles. VentureStar has had a delay. All of this enthusiasm, they got started early, they have put off. I think it's probably been delayed about a year, in my own opinion. They've got a lot of engineering problems to solve before they can push ahead. But Brazoria County and Kennedy County have both made presentations, packages put together that we will probably send in on the VentureStar. Another one of the operations that's around that doesn't get very much publicity, but which I think is probably one of the more exciting ideas around is Space Access. Space Access has visited both these sites. Here in the state of Texas, we have a lot to offer, especially in this area. We've got the community of interest and all of the software, if you will, in the terms of people's brain power. We don't have a lot of facilities. That's why every couple of years we have to face the question of let's move the Johnson Space Center, let's move the astronauts down to Florida, or let's move them to Huntsville, Alabama. They have facilities in place. We need to do something like that. What we've been doing with this current session of the legislature is trying to get the legislation through that will enable people to establish spaceport authorities, to get power of eminent domain, to be able to have a taxing base, to be able to get tax relief and things like that. I think that's probably enough to give you a background on Texas Aerospace Commission. I know that a lot of you probably don't know much about it, but that's what we do. We do it on a very thin budget, and frankly, we're overworked.
Thank you, Walter. I'm going to quickly introduce myself, and then we'll introduce the other guests, allow them to say a few words. My name is Brendan Keefe. I'm, by default, the technology and space reporter at KPRC Channel 2 here in Houston. The reason I say by default is there is not one dedicated space and technology reporter in the city of Houston. For that matter, there's not one dedicated television news reporter in Orlando, Daytona, Cape Canaveral area, in that market, dedicated to space and technology reporting. Can you believe it? In 1999, on the very cusp of the new millennium, in these two great space cities, we do not have a dedicated space and technology reporter. What's great for a reporter like me coming in on a little less than 2 years ago is that there's a tremendous vacuum to be filled, and since no one is in that position, I could have kind of slid into that position. But it's amazing, you just go down to Johnson Space Center, and if you don't know, you have to stop at building 110 to get your car pass, then building 2 to get your press pass. It will take you all day just to get on site. By the same token, there's really no longer a relationship directly between the media, at least the broadcast media, and either Kennedy Space Center or JSC, because there's no dedicated space and technology reporters. So that's difficult. Every time there's a space or technology story that involves NASA, NASA has to meet a new reporter who knows nothing about the industry. And it's really sad because you know, there's a special language if you don't know those acronyms. You know, there are a number that will throw you off. I always tell people I'm candidate for the EBEL, and they just nod and say yes, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. And if they ask and admit they don't know what I'm talking about, I tell them that EBEL stands for Earthbound Extended Lunch. But sometimes they don't get that one. Just one little side note on that, it's funny how in the early days of NASA, the early 60s, the late 50s, when NASA was first born, they did not use acronyms. A lot of people aren't aware of that. And they used full names. For example, what is now, I believe, the LCC, or the Launch Control Center at Kennedy Space Center, was the Space Operations Building. Well, when they went to acronyms, that would have been, of course, the SOB. And they decided to change that name. Another famous one, and I won't tell you what it spells out, you can do the math yourself, but the Saturn Launch Umbilical Tower was also scrapped as a name, and I don't recall what it was changed to, because it's no longer used. Anyhow, one quick thing, it seems we all have something to say, and I want to be as brief as I can, but it is amazing when you hear Walter Cunningham talk about $200,000, which of course for any individual would be a lot of money. For an entire organization dedicated to space exploration and development in the state of Texas, it's absurd, an absurd amount. When you realize that one water tower in the city of Houston is costing us $6.85 million. Just for a water tower. Maybe if these folks could wait just about 5 years for that water tower, we could better fund something like this. It's absolutely amazing. By the same token, in the entertainment industry, we have, I think it was, the budget was $85 million for Armageddon, which essentially was an hour-and-a-half video for the band Aerosmith. Absolutely no, legitimate realism or any accuracy whatsoever. It's really quite a comedy for anyone who knows anything about the space program. However, given that $85 million budget, the whole plot of the movie is based upon a comet or asteroid hitting the Earth, and our budget to study NEOs, or near-Earth objects, is somewhere around $1 million, $1.5 million. I mean, it's laughable. So we may end up with the real thing if we're not careful. Anyhow, before I go on any further, I do want to introduce our other guests. For one, first off, before we get to the other speakers, in the audience here we have Dawn Lindsay, who is a representative of Tom DeLay's office. Tom DeLay, as you know, is the majority whip, is the third-ranking Republican in the House of Representatives, and is a very strong advocate for the space program here in Texas and certainly nationwide. He has a very loud voice in Congress. Even though he's a soft-spoken man, what he says carries a lot of weight, so we're very happy to have here today. Also, I'd like to introduce Joe Mayer, who is here with Boeing, also a former aide to a senator, is that correct? Yes, very well. And also we have Councilman Rob Todd here to also speak about the city's involvement with the space program, since the focus here today is, of course, government's role in the new space frontier. With that said, let me introduce Joe Mayer to just say a few words, introduce himself.
Okay, why don't you just move it over here? I've got a few notes that I wrote to myself, and it might be good if I had had an opportunity to be able to look down every once in a while and see what's there. Appreciate NSS putting this on. I was running late trying to pull together the mayor household on a Saturday morning. It was a little bit tough, and rode over here with my son Stephen, listening to a Scooby-Doo tape all the way over, so you never know if I might break out into song and somewhat, it's not Martian speak, but maybe Scooby-Doo. Also, I did work on Capitol Hill, and I'm here in a personal capacity. I'm not here as an employee of the Boeing company, so my remarks are my personal remarks. I have found in the past that having worked on Capitol Hill and done congressional relations work and so forth, and I've been down here in Houston for about 2 years and spent a good bit of time in Washington, D.C., that I get kind of two different reactions from people that I work with, broadly speaking. One is that they assume since I'm not doing that, I must have amnesia. I've forgotten everything I ever know, and I'm really stupid. I don't know anything about Congress, and since I'm not in a capacity where I deal with Congress, therefore I have nothing to offer. On the other hand, they consider me Moses, that I'm coming down from the mountain, and here are the Ten Commandments, and here's the way it is, and so forth and so on, and then I know everything. Well, I really think the truth is, frankly, somewhere in between. I am not Moses, nor am I an idiot, so I don't have amnesia either. So keeping that as a context for some of my remarks. When you look at the role of the federal government in dealing with space development, I think some of us might say if they could just take the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. You know, it's the kind of sense of, hi, I'm with the federal government, I'm here to help you, thank you very much. I would rather do it on my own. And the other kind of shorthand we might go for, particularly those who are interested in entrepreneurial development of space, is please just get out of the way. And yet I think in some respects certainly life is usually more complicated than those kinds of slogans, although they reflect a certain orientation that maybe is more true than not. In terms of this particular panel, I wrote down, and maybe it's to save myself, I wrote down that I would hope that we treat it somewhat as a workshop rather than a lecture. I'm interested in knowing what you all think. By the way, before 2 years ago, I never said y'all. Remember, I didn't know that the plural of y'all is all y'all. So that's probably, but I got one of my colleagues, he's teaching me, and I'm getting there. And I almost never...
Is that y'all's? That's the possessive form, y'all's.
I almost never say you guys anymore, but I do catch myself every once in a while. And I have obliterated all the remarks I'm making to Tom DeLay one way or the other. They're all very positive. And Tom does, he speaks with a soft voice, but carries a pretty formidable influence in Washington, D.C. The political environment, from my vantage point, is really somewhat mixed from a national government perspective. If you look at space development, with respect to budgets overall, it's not really particularly good. You know what we've come to now? We celebrate not losing a lot of ground. We were going to lose a significant amount of budget, and now the projections have kind of flattened out. And okay, we should go around and be happy. We should celebrate that success. It's a relative thing, but when you come to the point where you're thinking you're celebrating, kind of trying to stay even, and I don't doubt that, I don't have really any thoughts that y'all were out holding parties when you heard that the budget might stay flat or anything. But there is a sense of big victories. We're not going to go into the gutter, so we've got something that we can celebrate and hold on to. And I guess in relative terms, that's worth celebrating considering the alternatives. But that's a pretty mixed bag. There are no bold visions in the budget for space development, and there are no budgets no monies to support any bold visions. I think, on the other hand, that philosophically, the federal government over the last few years has been much more conducive and supportive of the idea of space development from the perspective of the involvement of the commercial sector, space commercialization, the role and the opportunities for private sector to play a part. I think philosophically, the Congress has been more attuned to that. Some of the key members, whether it's a Mr. Rohrabacher or Mr. Walker, who has retired, and others, have promoted that and have been at the forefront and the vanguard. And I think in some respects, you don't really look to Congress to be a force of revolutionary change. At least it's never been my experience in particular that that's where you're going to get, the revolution. But you have individuals in the Congress who are very thought-provoking, look ahead, look beyond what really is possible, exercise that leadership thing, and see where we might go, if not where we are and what all the barriers are, what all the speed bumps are, but what the end objective is. And I think Mr. Rohrabacher, for example, has done that really rather effectively, and I think that reflects somewhat his experience of having worked for Ronald Reagan. I mean, and he would, I think he conceded that Ronald Reagan tended to be not necessarily all in space or so forth, but as general, tended to be a visionary. He wasn't worried about all the practical steps of how you were going to do this and how the Cold War was going to be ended and how so forth and so forth and so on, but he had a sense of where he wanted to go, where he was going to take the nation. And so I think we have key members that have played that role. And I think that philosophically, over the last several years, you have a Congress that's attuned to the private sector. Now, I think members of Congress would be the first one to stand up and say that they're not particularly expert of knowing how all this works, but, they want to help. They want to help, and it goes beyond a little bit that I'm with Washington, and I want to help. The budget cuts, while in many respects, I think it is a downside and a negative to space development, a really healthy, robust, across-the-board space program, have also had some interesting positive side effects, I believe, as well. And I think that we can see this in our, we take an example of your own family budget. If it gets crunched and you really have to scrutinize what you're doing, there's times when you kind of redirect where you're going. You invest your money a little bit differently. And I think that has had the same effect within NASA, and I think Dan Golden has used that to his advantage to change NASA, for example. And I think members of Congress have used that as a way to reorient what the space program is about. In this respect, one is looking for increased opportunities for the private sector to play a role in the development of space. So one thing is you have less money in this pot of money. You go out and you still want to do certain things. You go out and you say, well, where can we get some other money? Well, we need to have more of a partnership role with the private sector. We need more private sector involvement. So from that vantage point, you have that. I think it's also helped reorient NASA. There may be a sense that the agency doesn't move as fast as some might want it to move, particularly please move out of the way type of thing. But you have a different orientation. I think that orientation, you see that in things like Spaceflight Operations Contract, SFOC, for where you try to move day-to-day operation of some of your space activities with respect to the space shuttle, for example, and move that in the direction of the private sector. We're far from privatizing the operation of the space shuttle, but if you look at, I like the vector. I mean, we're moving in a direction that says let's look at the private sector to do day-to-day operations, to apply the things that they do better to the efficiency of the operations of the space shuttle. You also have the Consolidated Space Operations Contract, CSOC. And again, the same kind of sense. Let's consolidate, let's give this more in the direction of the private sector. Let's see what they can do to be more efficient. The other orientation I think that you have at NASA as a result of reduced budgets is a kind of rethinking about what is our mission, and it complements that notion of our mission is not to run the shuttle program day to day. Our mission is not to do space ops day to day. So what are we all about? And that's why I think you hear Dan Golden talking about the focus on technology and cutting edge technology and enabling technology so that you can develop that so that the private sector then can take that and utilize that. It's a different orientation, and I think it reflects a reality or utilizing the the opportunity of reduced budgets to rethink about your investment decisions. The other part is I forget because I didn't write it down. I had a thought there someplace, but y'all forgive me because I forgot it, and all y'all. And again, going back to this notion of a mixed bag, but of a Congress that's philosophically more oriented to wanting to do things in space as it relates to commercial space and private sector. I still don't think clearly there's, when you think about space development, I think we need to look across the whole spectrum of what we would do in space. A healthy, robust government program, a lot of involvement of the private sector, a lot of entrepreneurial activity, and clearly Congress is looking for the private sector to do more. They're not particularly expert necessarily in figuring out how to help the private sector to do more, but they definitely aren't signing up for any big old government missions. It's pretty much the status quo. But in that commercial arena, you had activity related to licensing of RLV, reusable launch vehicle activity that the Congress enacted last year. That was important for those kinds of activities. You have push in the direction of let's figure out ways that we can commercialize the activities and the operations of the International Space Station once it becomes operational. We just had the House of Representatives review the NASA authorization bill, and there were about 4 or 5 amendments on space station. I believe only one of them, I'm not sure, but I think only one of them was approved. Most of them were defeated by rather large margins, and they had to deal with, let's throw the Russians out, let's kill the programs, and those kinds of things, and those went down to serious defeat. But there is an amendment, and help me out, I think it was by Congressman Cook of Utah, but he had an amendment that was intended to, let's accelerate our analysis and reporting back of opportunities for commercializing the space program and exploring commercial users and identifying commercial users for a space station. That was approved. Again, I think that reflects a certain sense that Congress is in tune with wanting to do this, and I think that Dan Golden wants to do it. You have issues where we're looking at indemnification, dealing with space launches, and the need for where the private sector fits in, and looking down the road as to maybe where the government starts to back out of that area over the long term. Spaceport legislation, interest in the state, interest in the Congress, those kinds of initiatives dealing with state-related space launch activities are there. And then you have various things, although it doesn't look like it's going anywhere, loan guarantee proposals like Senator Breaux has and so forth, where that's going to go. But I think what you see is there's stuff going on. People are interested. You might say, yeah, but they're not doing it very well, or it's not getting passed. Well, it's the glass half full, half empty. I'm not sure. That's for everyone to decide, and whether or not you're satisfied. If it's half full or half empty, we got to figure out how we get the other half and work with that. I would comment that we also are seeing, and it concerns me, is that from a foreign policy and national security perspective, there's activities that have been taken, particularly as it relates to China, and the handling of licensing activity that can really may end up, and it's hurting right now, but may have a serious detrimental impact on an area where space commerce has been very active, alive, and very good, and that's in communication satellites and so forth. Because as the decision was made to move that authority, that review authority out of the Department of Commerce over to the Department of State, what state has done in not applying the resources, the human resources and budget resources needed to review those licensing and those reviews in a timely manner, and expanding the scope of what they're doing, is it's putting the Lorals and others communication satellite companies at a serious disadvantage. So that's an area where it's been a healthy, prosperous commercial space related business activity, and it's hurting right now because of other considerations. I'll stop, but when we do conclude, I like to go back to where I began a bit, and that is how do you think things are going? What is your perspective? Are you optimistic or are you pessimistic about the future of space development? Thank you very much.
Very good, thank you. From mayor to councilman, Joe Mayor that is, I'd like to introduce the Honorable Rob Todd.
Thank you for having me out today. How many of y'all are from How many of y'all are from Houston? How many of y'all are from Texas? I was just curious. That's not a joke. I'm just curious about it. This y'all know, Houston is not the capital of Texas, but more importantly, Dallas is not the capital of Texas. If anybody says that, there's like a major penalties here for saying that. Austin is the capital.
Aren't you going to ask how many voters from your council district?
How many voters in my council district? There, all right. I love it. A lot of folks wonder what involvement cities can have in space development. And it may surprise you to hear my answer. My district includes NASA. And I'm a councilman from the city of Houston, which is the fourth largest city in the country. We have a budget in the city of $2.5 billion a year, to include all of our funds, $2.5 billion a year. And our gross industrial output in the Houston area is larger than that of Hong Kong, and it's half that of the country of Turkey. Cities, in my opinion, are becoming almost, it reminds me of Italian politics of several hundred years ago. I think that the large cities are becoming almost like city-states, because as they grow larger and larger, the cities take on an expanded role in everyday life. And for the space industry to be looking at all of its options, it needs to look at city involvement, or else it's missing one of the big things that's happening today. In my opinion, there's always going to be a role for government in space science and space exploration. And at the same time, I think that there is an existing role that is only going to grow in the future for the commercialization of space. And unfortunately, right now, we're at a critical point in that where the private sector, for it to really capitalize on space science, there's not enough money there to make it happen quickly. And so we're sort of at a point where we're on the verge of it happening in a big way, but it's not happening yet. And there's a lot of things that government can do, I think, to help stimulate that conversion. I want to tell you where I think government's role is in the government contracting side of space exploration. But there's a maxim in politics that's actually as part of the Republican Women's Club national platform, but I think it's a really good statement, and it kind of defines where I think government should be involved in space science. And that is that government should only do things that the private sector cannot do or cannot do well. And I think that kind of summarizes what government's role ought to be in space science. Research that is on the level of what NASA does is research that the private sector cannot do. And that is why the space station is important to keep it funded. That is why the NASA mission is so important, is because this is science on a level that the private sector cannot afford to do. At the same time, if it is something that the private sector can do and can do well, we need to do what we can to encourage that, because the bottom line in all the government contracting is that there has to be a payoff in the end. I've been up to Washington for the last 4 years on the Keep It Sold missions, and one of the things we always told the people in Washington is that for every dollar we put into R&D, we get $7 back in private sector spinoffs. And a lot of those spinoffs that we have, a lot of potential spinoffs, have not been capitalized on because the capital is not there. So what I want to talk about more is what I think the city can do to encourage the commercialization of space, and also to talk a little bit about what government will continue to need to do. City government has a number of roles it can play. Let's talk about this on a practical basis. In my district, I have the largest concentration of engineers in this area than there is any place else in the world. That's the truth. And all these engineers who work at Boeing, who work at all the aerospace contractors, they love working at their companies, but they have all these ideas that in their mind that if they just had the money, they could really make a lot of money, they could really make products, they could change the world. But the reason that a lot of them don't make that jump is because they don't have the know-how, they don't have the finances, they don't have the the encouragement or the guts, or there's a lot of reasons why they can't do it. These are all questions that the city of Houston deals with on a day-to-day basis, because whether or not you want to make a satellite or whether or not you want to sell tacos, there's not much difference, and that's the truth. In business sense, there's not much difference. So what the city of Houston has done in traditional sense for business development, we've had mentoring programs, we've had business incubators, we've had there's small business loans you can get, etc. And what I think the city needs to do for the aerospace community to really make it happen is we need to get involved on a larger level, because the critical difference between opening up a taco stand and making a satellite that will go into space is that it only costs around $20,000 to make good fajitas in a restaurant, whereas it's going to cost millions and millions and millions of dollars to send a satellite up there. So one of the ideas that I got on that, where cities can help, and this is mainly for large cities, and this in Texas, and I know the law in Texas is different than the law in other states, and I'm a lawyer too, by the way, so I'll make good medicine for space vehicles someday. But one of the things that we can do on a local level is pension funds. Cities have large pension funds. In the city of Houston, we have over $1 billion in our pension fund, and what do we invest it in? We put it into a lot of things. We put it into certificates of deposit, we put some of it into the stock market, some of it in mutual funds, some of it in limited partnerships. We're allowed to put it wherever we want. It has to be good investments. We're even investing in a golf course in Austin right now. Well, I got to thinking about it, and I thought, a lot of these companies that are in aerospace have a real need for venture capital, and venture capital is hard to come by. And in my opinion, municipalities, especially if you take the city-state image to heart, cities are going to be having growing pension funds, cities and counties and small local government. And in my opinion, I think that we're really missing the boat on a local level if we don't start investing some of our money into the aerospace community and the startups that are out here. Everyone in this room here, I guarantee you, knows somebody who has a good idea they're trying to get off the ground, but they don't have money for it. Well, venture capital is such that it invests in high-risk things that can't attract capital from banks, can't just run and take out a loan because you've got a long startup period, or it's too risky, or all of the above. So, in my opinion, cities can capitalize on that. I understand that it's high risk. I understand that a high percentage will fail, but let's say you invest in 10 things and 9 of them go down to 2, and the one that is there winds up being the next Boeing. Well, I sure hope I'm a city employee when that happens, because I'll look forward to my pension. Or the next compact computer, which started in the garage, by the way. So all these things are things that venture capital can be involved in, and the pension funds can play an important role. There's lots of other things. City of Houston has immense regulatory issues, fire code, plumbing code. These are all things that can impede small business from starting up. And I chair the Regulatory Affairs Committee, and so I'm always trying to look at these things to see what we can do to reduce regulation, to make it more attractive for businesses to flourish. We can also, in the city of Houston, act as a gatekeeper. We're a large city, and so we're a gatekeeper on the federal level to the federal government. We're a gatekeeper to state government. We're a gatekeeper to the educational system, because school districts in Texas are governed by a different unit than the city of Houston or the cities. And what I think is critical for the cities to do is to make certain that the space program is not some mysterious thing that the average person can't comprehend. It's got to be accessible, and frankly, it's got to be something that's available to everyone without regard to your ethnicity. If you look at the conference here, it's primarily an Anglo audience, right? Primarily. And I think it's a real task of government to make certain that we get the word out that it doesn't matter where your family's from. If you have a good idea and you're interested in the space industry, you need to get involved in it. I'm a science fiction fan, and I like science fiction. And one of the things that I like about it is that when they present their view of the future, they're always very careful to have a very heterogeneous crew on ships. And I've always liked that image, and I think it's unfortunate to me that it has to be the science fiction industry that presents that, because I think that's something that government needs to present. And one way that we can do that is to make certain that in the school system that the kids all, no matter what part of town they're from, no matter how bad the neighborhood is they're from, that they're included in the process, they're allowed to dream a little bit, and in the future I think that'll pay off. So, if I give you an idea about if I had my wish list on a local level, I'd like for Ellington Field to be our space incubator locally. I'd like for pension funds to be used for fund aerospace projects. I'd like to have a regulatory structure that is such that you are allowed to do what you've got to do to get your experimental project going. I'd like to have a building built there where we can have very inexpensive rents, an incubator, so that your costs are kept low. Because these are all just plain Jane, ordinary business problems. It's money. And if you can't afford to get your business, your building and all that together, then you're not going to get your space project going. I like the dream too, but there's some practical things on that level. And then lastly, the city of Houston has got to play a more active role, and cities in general have got to play a more active role on a federal level in communicating that the aerospace industry is about jobs. And I'd like to see on a federal level a tariff schedule for liability similar to what the airlines have. If you look in the back of your plane ticket, you'll see that when you lose your airplane bag, that you, even though you might have had, your mother's Hope Diamond, and you're going to be limited to, I think it's $100 or $200 in value for your bag. And we do that because the airlines industry was being encouraged to develop, encouraged to grow, and Boeing would not be here if it wasn't for that. I mean, they wouldn't be here on this level if it wasn't for that statute. It gives the airlines and the airline manufacturing industry some idea of what their liability is going to be if one of their planes go down. And we've got to do that for private launches. If we don't do that, we will be way behind the curve. Unless you're on the East Coast, we'll be way behind the curve in developing launches from Texas. And unless you're doing a south launch from here, your liability is going to be extreme because you don't want it to crash over Minnesota, California. Well, Dallas will be okay. We'll get an award for that. Actually, we want to have a statute to encourage that. But I'm just kidding. But we, hopefully, Rob Milosevic. But we need to have that statute in place too, so that the companies that are out there will know what their liability exposure is. Because if we do that, then we're going to have an easier time getting insurance to cover the risk. Okay, that's why we got to do it. But the city alone cannot do that. That's got to be a federal issue. It's not a state issue. It's got to be a federal issue. And we all need to push for that at a local level to make certain it's a priority. I know that Marianne's been active in that at the precinct level, trying to get the state to do it. And for some reason, when you get at the state level, people just gloss over on issues like that. So it's up to the cities to make that a priority and push for it and add it to our lobbying teams' priorities for the year. Anyway, I have lots of things I want to say, but I know we want to save time for questions, I guess. Thanks for having me out.
Good evening. Our top story tonight, Councilman Rob Todd suggested the destruction of Dallas this evening. And immediately his poll numbers went through the roof. Well, let's get into some more of the discussion, and perhaps we can do it kind of in a round robin type format, and then we can get on to even having some questions and answers. I know that, what is our limit, by the way? Do you know what?
We're supposed to be done tomorrow.
We're supposed to be done, it's not going to happen. I'm just
But there's nothing in this room immediately after.
Oh, good, good.
This meeting's supposed to go for lunch.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so there's a lot of hungry people out there going, finish speaking, please.
You want to walk through the charts?
Yeah, why don't we do that? Actually, since you prepared them, would you like to go through them?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Some of us NSS members from local chapter here in Clear Lake got together and we went with the National Space Site has a policy committee, and we put out position papers. You can get copies of these from the National Space Site headquarters on various issues. But we wanted to keep this one at the level of what is the government's role, sort of at the different level. We have one on the role of the federal government, the way the National Space Site sees it, is to continue a world leadership, provide user-friendly regulatory frameworks, further development of new technologies, and encourage economic opportunity. And I think these gentlemen have all pretty well agreed with those things. And see what we had, the next chart was what we think Congress can do then to meet those goals would be to articulate a vision for NASA and require them to report on the Space Settlements Act. This is an act that quite a few years ago, and NASA was supposed to be required to say how well they've done, and they have not been turning in those reports because basically nobody's been bugging them about it. So we want to make that one of our jobs, to have them come forward and say, hey NASA, we know you're doing good stuff, but what are you doing it for? And the reason that they're doing it is to encourage space settlements. Streamlining licensing and leading efforts to establish international law to encourage space settlement. I know Wayne White talked about property rights this morning. That's one of the issues that will be brought up at Unispace this summer, and the National Space Society is involved with that as well. We want to increase NASA and DoD budgets for space research and technology development. We have a few examples of some of the things that we want to see encouraged, especially in situ resource utilization. These budgets keep being cut, and every year for the last 5 years, the NASA budget has either been flat or declined. And once again, they put in a proposal this year to cut it. And if you want something like the Trans-Hab or some of these new technologies to be developed, you need to have your voices heard. You need to be calling your congressman, let them know that these things are important to you, because they do respond. I'm sure Joe and Dawn will tell you, if she's on the phone with me, please don't let them cut the Trans-Hab. Don't let them do this. You know, and so but it means a lot to hear from their constituents. They want to know that it's important to you. So you have a role to play. And we want the Congress to buy commercial products and services from industry and privatize routine operations, including early commercial use of the space station. So let's see. Now, the role of the state and local governments, we think, is to provide a favorable regulatory and tax environment, like what Todd was saying, provide a technically, scientifically educated workforce. I think this was an issue we didn't really touch on too much, but I think the Texas Aerospace Commission also helps out in this area. And create a clearly identifiable government body which has the authority to make these decisions. Because some of the problems these businesses have been having is that they don't know who to go to for help. And so, okay, keep going to the next one. So that's kind of a summary of how the National Space Society views this thing. And our recommendations were that citizens and business should work with the government to identify the problem areas and implement the solutions to remove those barriers for settling the frontier. And that government should provide a visionary leadership, support the research and the education, regulatory and international initiatives that will open the space frontier to all its citizens in the next millennium. So that's a summary of where the National Space Society is on these topics. And we have specific papers on specific things like solar power in space and returning to the moon and so on. We have position papers that we'd be happy to share with you. So if you'd like to, I'll hand it back over to Brandon.
Oh, we have a hand here.
First question is, what's the government's role in providing space traffic control and launch range safety?
Okay, we have a question from the field already. So the idea is, what is the government's role in providing essentially air traffic control for space? Is that correct?
And launch range safety.
And launch range safety. Are you talking about the government's role in private space launches? Okay, very well. Would anybody like to field that?
Actually, the FAA has stepped forward to try to fill the role that they have in aviation, and some of the manufacturers are working very closely. We've been working very closely with FAA. They've got the the authority to certify various space facilities, if you will, and certainly any spaceports. And when it comes to range safety, that's going to be regulated by all the usual institutions, insurance, and what have you. One of the reasons to try to get away from the rockets that we have is to get the insurance rates down, and that's certainly a function of safety and what the exposure is. When it comes down to spaceports, you've got an envelope of about 3 different launch profiles that's going to have to make the cut. You go out of Florida, for example, you can do one of the principal ones. You can go due east. You can also handle the International Space Station orbit, about 50 degrees inclination, give or take a little bit. You can't go polar, and that's another requirement that's highly desirable. When you go out of Vandenberg, of course, you can go polar. You can't go east. you can't go up to the space station. That's why we've got a nice advantage sitting down here in the Gulf Coast. We can actually fly all those profiles and come within the range safety aspects of it. While I have the mic in my hand, I'd like to address a comment that Marianne put up here. You talked about some of the things you'd like to see funded, and you're campaigning for the funding of those. You mentioned TransHab. I don't know about the relative merits of TransHab. I'm not that familiar with TransHab. But if we would quit throwing money down the Russian rat hole for the last couple of years, we could have financed a whole lot of these things. And that's going on today, and I'm asking, where was your organization? I doubt if they were campaigning against that kind of financing, and it's going to prove to be very costly for us indeed. At the same time, you have a TransHab up there, which, as I understand it, Congress just recently voted to not include in the next budget, and it was probably getting tired of the same brush as a totally ridiculous program, Triana, which also you probably have a lot of enthusiasts out here that are supporting it. Something proposed by that scientific illiterate Al Gore. And all I am saying is you can't be supportive of everything. We don't have unlimited resources. You have got to pick and choose. And in this case, this administration, it picked, it chose back in 1992 to make ridiculous agreements with Russians, and we're paying the price today while your favorite program is not getting funded.
Ooh, it's getting exciting, isn't it? It's getting interesting. You know, it's interesting that what you bring up. I think the Russians are something we need to address in terms of, I guess we didn't realize how much we needed the Soviet Union to a degree. We almost needed a Cold War. It'd be interesting to address this. We have a couple of questions from the field. First off, did everybody hear about last week's arrest of the deputy minister? Okay, everybody heard about this. The deputy space program in Russia is in jail right now for assaulting police officers after a vodka binge and was found in his boxer shorts on the beach. It's capitalism. That's what's driving this. No, go ahead.
The question wasn't quite complete.
Sure.
Spacecraft control isn't simply making sure that the rockets get off the pad, don't hurt anybody. It's making sure your satellites and other space facilities don't get other space facilities or impacted by debris. What's the government's role in making sure that?
Well, currently we have NORAD tracking those things. Isn't that true?
NORAD provides DOD, NASA.
No, NORAD tracks every single space item. As a matter of fact, they even, if it's as small as a screw, they track that and
you know, I don't have a question, but or an answer, but the question implies something. I mean, you don't either ask a question because you just want to know some factual information, and this is clearly a loaded question. If you could expound upon your views, I would appreciate it.
NORAD will not provide full assistance to non-government. They do track it all. Commercial, they're probably not willing to tell you because of the liability.
I think you're treating a non-problem. If it ain't broke, don't fix it yet.
Why does shuttle loom every time they go longer to potential?
well, this as the moderator, I have to take control here, pull in the reins, and say I think this would be an excellent discussion, perhaps to hold immediately following the. Because it doesn't exactly fit into the topic which we're discussing completely. Unless, I mean, you can overrule me. Anybody who wants to overrule me, that's fine.
We've got other questions.
Okay, go ahead.
I think a couple of topics got touched on, but they haven't really been addressed yet in this forum. Maybe this is the forum. But one is education and the other is ethnic mix. To me, you know, to bring out the raw talent that's available, those would be places that I would commit funds or activity or energy or something in, you know, finding talent right throughout the whole university that exists. And these people might still, you know,
Right. Well, you know, one thing before we get to that is that we have a fairly good ethnic mix and a fairly good gender mix in certainly in the astronaut corps, the government astronaut corps, NASA. Although we have a very limited mix in terms of intellectual background. In other words, we're talking about almost, as a matter of fact, the astronaut corps currently limits to engineers and you have to have a degree in either engineering or, what is that? I'm sorry, well, yeah, the physical sciences, it has to be something to that effect. Except in terms of, some payload specialists could, kind of opt out of that. But
I don't know that the answer, the question has a single answer. I mean, I'll give you just a personal perspective, and that is, I get a little bit more nervous about the government getting into the arena of how it determines what the mix of the diversity of the future players in the space arena are. I think it carries a lot of baggage with it, and a lot of it ends up being counterproductive. I personally kind of hit on the think globally or think cosmically, but act locally. From my vantage point, I'm less worried about what the federal government might be able to do to promote education and so forth. I'm more interested in what can my company do to be a partner with my community, broadly speaking, to ensure that children are aware of their opportunities, that they are encouraged to take science and math, that we have mentoring programs, that we have job shadowing programs. I'm much more, you do that on a massive scale with all kinds of not only companies, but individuals. That there are lots of opportunities to be engaged, for NSS to be engaged, to be in the schools, to be talking to kids, et cetera, et cetera. From my vantage point, that's where my hope is, and not in what, for example, not that you implied it, but from my perspective, not what the federal government could do to help promote that goal.
I don't know of any talented individual of any color, shape, or what have you that's precluded from being in the space program. As a matter of fact, on the contrary, I'd say we've gone way overboard to go the other way. I can recall, I'm what you call an ancient astronaut. And I can recall back when the objective was to select the best person you could find for the job when there was not quotas. At about the time I was leaving, they were coming up with quotas. Now, we can afford the luxury of doing some of this now because we have a large vehicle that carries a lot of passengers. But does it mean we have the best crews on board? I'm not sure it does. I tell you what I am sure of. I'm sure that we would not have the best crews on board if our object was to see if we couldn't have some kind of ethnic balances, gender balances, the ridiculous talk of an all-female crew and all of these kind of things that are coming up diverts us from what the job of NASA is. NASA's job is not social engineering.
Well, just to put that information, this year we sent up the first woman shuttle commander, who was also the first woman shuttle pilot previously. So that's interesting. And I think what's more interesting is the lack of fanfare about it. It's when we have the marching bands and the ticker tape parades that it's saying, oh great, a woman has finally commanded a shuttle. No, what's great is that it is kind of going without much press and without much fanfare. Because it's gotten to the point where it's simply, she's achieved this on her own regardless of her gender, and I think that marks something in our as a matter of fact, we're focusing more on the identical twin who's going on up October 14th than we are on the female shuttle command.
I have an additional thought on the subject that's much more important. It has to do with a political definition of the crews. We have, even though I am not enthusiastic about what we have done with the Russians, I've got nothing against working with the Russians. I've known and worked with them for a long time, but I believe they ought to pay their way. I don't like us subsidizing when we have other things to do. As a result of this agreement that we've been into with the Russians, we now have the International Space Station going up, for better or for worse, later, more expensive, whatever it is. The first 4 crews have had a political definition of what those crews are. The first one, for example, we've got an American commander and 2 Russians, then you got a Russian commander and 2 Americans, and vice versa, back and forth. That does not bode well for trying to do the best job you can in manning these, especially if you want to really get into it and you sit down and take a look at the difference in philosophies of command and control, both onboard missions and air to ground. They are totally different. Our guys that flew on the Mir have come back with the biggest adjustment they've had to make is to how to survive and operate within the Russian environment. And it took a long time to do so. I predict that we're going to be glossing over the problems, but nevertheless, it will not go as smoothly as it ought to because of this political decision on flight crews.
We have a question you've been waiting for some time.
I understand that Texas is interested in a launch facility, and I know there's a lot of other states that are too, and I'm wondering whether Texas was aware of the Alaskan initiative. What Alaska is talking about doing, and one of the problems that I understand that you have is that some of the launches are going overseas. The satellite manufacturers that want to get launches are going overseas because the governments over there are subsidizing the launches. So what Alaska is proposing is that they are going to finance the launches with tax-free bonds. And then those are going to be paid back by the satellite manufacturers over the life of the satellite. And I think that that's a good idea. I was wondering if Texas was interested in doing the same thing. And I was also thinking that that would be an excellent thing to bring to Washington to make it not only state tax-free, but federal tax-free.
It might be a good thing. I can tell you that we're much earlier in that pipeline here in Texas, just trying to get legislation that will establish spaceport authorities and the like. I would like to hear more about that because it seems to make some sense to me. I'm not sure economically it'll work out in the long run, but it might be saleable.
Well, Florida's already done it. Texas has tried to, too. Many states with sports authorities. You know, Florida, for example, basically forgives all taxes if you want to build a stadium. It's amazing amount of money that we're putting into that, given the amount of interest also in the space programs. Do we have another question back here?
It's the question around sticking to the council. Good idea of putting city funds into venture capital, space venture capital. But careful with the small print. We tried that in West Virginia, and that led directly to crony capitalism, and we got still a bunch of people in jail.
Yeah, I agree, and that's the main reason. And it's interesting because the idea was first brought to my attention about 3 years ago, and I thought it was a good idea. And the main reason that I don't have a concrete proposal is I'm trying to figure out how to write the thing up so that we don't have that. And that may be, I don't think it's insurmountable, but it's a real concern because, I mean, we have a fiduciary responsibility to the pensioners to make certain that their money is invested wisely. And I mean, I'm sure that you all could probably think of quite a few things the government's gotten into that were pretty stupid ideas. So I agree with you entirely on that. And once again, that's the reason that there's no concrete proposal at the present time.
You got a question here?
Yeah. Let me follow up on the gentleman here. This is from Mr. City Council. What specific things City of Houston is doing to encourage development of new spin-off of aerospace companies in Houston or in Cunningham? Are there any specific examples you can give?
There's actually quite a few things. There's some things I would still like for us to do. The city right now is considering funding CLADEF, for one thing, for Clear Lake Area Economic Development Foundation for the purpose of doing local aerospace development. And part of what CLADEF and NASA are doing down here is the TOPS program, which has a direct role in the spin-off and the private development of space. I don't know what the actual acronym is, but whatever you call it, and companies that are using space technology spin-offs. There are some things that I would like for the city to do. There has never been a mayor from the city of Houston who attended a space shuttle launch. And there has never been a mayor from the city of Houston who has gone up to Washington on Keefe Soul mission. And I find that just shocking.
That's the purpose of the question.
Yeah, and I can tell you this, that I've been up each year, I've been in office, I've been up each year to Washington, and if I would love to go to every shuttle launch, but frankly, if I went to every shuttle launch, I think it's so fun that I'm afraid that if I did it too much, that I get accused by the media of using tax dollars for vacations. Because I think it's, but at the same time, I think that this symbolically, I think that the mayor, every mayor of Houston ought to be there once, just to show their support for it. So, thank you. Call Lee Brown and remind him. But he, I tried to get Brown up there this year to Washington. He didn't go. He knows that he had promised already he'd go to at least one launch, and he was done. Bob Lanier did the same thing. Catherine Winmeyer did the same thing. Blah blah blah. I don't know what it is. I don't know what's so hard about flying to Orlando, going and seeing the space shuttle launch from the Disneyland for a day and flying back home. I don't understand how that's hard. But anyway, I think that symbolically we ought to do that. Now, we'll say this, that both the present controller for the city of Houston, Sylvia Garcia, and the former controller, Lloyd Kelly, did go up to Washington on Keefe sold missions, and although it's inaccurate to say that they're second in command of the city, it's, I think conceptually, it's a higher ranking person than a council member to go up there. So there's a lot of things the city is doing. There's a lot of things that we could be doing, and I think that the cautionary note this man had about the city getting involved in NASA things is good, because there's a lot of angles to that. It's, you know, when you politicize space, I think that gets dangerous too. So I don't know. There's a lot of things we could do.
It's hard to hear over the growling stomachs, so what we'll do right now, we have gone over. Anyone who would like to leave and go to lunch right now, no one will blame you. If anyone would like to stay and talk at all, we can do that. Okay, folks have to be in the lunch, so anybody who wants to stay and listen to me talk, no, just kidding.